So I love the way in which you brought together and connected to the Microsoft vision, that its mission statement so clearly states that it is about empowering every person on the planet. And that is Satya Nadella, the CEO's vision and his mission. And his own bonus is tied to diversity. And that, I think, is about how leaders at the top really live their mission and live the vision. And in the past, you and I have discussed the ways in which Microsoft's own client-driven diversity methods have propelled law firms like Hornik to become even more diverse and more inclusive, because it comes directly from clients such as Microsoft. So I think that kind of mutually reinforcing cause and effect relationship is so important. So
I couldn't agree more.
Yes. So on the basis of relationship building, there is no one who really lives the importance of building relationships than David Hornik. David Hornik is the principal at one of the largest what I would say venture capital firms, August Capital in Silicon Valley. He also teaches entrepreneurship at his alma mater, Stanford and Harvard Law School. Somebody who really embodies a statement that was made by Joseph Nye, the former dean of Harvard's Kennedy School, who also served in the Obama and the Clinton administration, is David Hornik. And Joseph Nye's memorable line is that leadership is not about a title. It's about living the values. A leadership title is like having a fishing license. It does not guarantee that you will catch any fish. And I made this statement because I know how much Mitch loves to fish, and how much that is part of your own kind of life, and the ways in which you spend reflecting on issues of leadership. So David, in so many ways, your own life of leadership, relationship building, allyship inspires us and inspires us to be your followers. You're also the first to be featured in Adam Grant's book, Givers and Takers. And you're the first featured giver. So something I want you to focus on this morning is some of the stories that you have shared with me and with my class on the ways in which you were also reawakened as to the power of diversity. Because it shows your humility and your desire to listen and learn, that you yourself realized that you could do better. And you were taught by diverse voices. So can you share some of those stories of how you came to identify a diversity gap in your own work and then went about closing that gap? David.
For sure. I mean, I think Rangana just likes to hear me talk about crying. I would like to start by saying that Mitch Zuckley and I started in the law together when we were young individuals, and I knew already then that he would lead and I would follow. So Mitch, more power to you. It's great to see.
Right back at you, David.
There is no question, and Mitch said it, right? The challenge we all have is to listen, and the challenge is to pay attention. It's not enough to hear it and ignore it. And so I had this moment of realization. I not only am I a venture capitalist, but one of the things that I have done that has really been a great opportunity to humanize the technology world is to create an event that's called The Lobby. And The Lobby is an invite-only gathering of the tech world to bring together thought leaders to talk about the future. One of the things that it has always been is not only a conversation about technology, but a conversation about life. It's been a conversation about we are humans and we are trying to be helpful to one another, and how can we do that? And so we not only discuss, technical topics and business topics, but we talk about raising families and we talk about making a better planet. Before I get to my failings, I'll talk about one relationship. I backed an incredibly wonderful founder, a woman named Evan Roosley, and Evelyn had been the tech reporter for initially the New York Times, and ultimately was a reporter for TechCrunch. And she and I got to know each other. And when she started a company that was a subscription baby food company, a really interesting idea, she came to me and said, David, you and I have had this relationship over a long period of time. I would love to talk to you about this company. I ended up backing the company very early, earlier than we usually do. And Evelyn and her co-founder, Angela, and I built this very strong relationship. And one of the things about my conferences, people often say to me, David, your conference is a little bit like you throwing your own wedding every year. It's this big gathering. It has a lot of detail and fun. And I thought this was a fun and interesting, comparison. And I decided that what would be really fun is to one day not only make that an analogy, but make it true. And so one year at my conference, we literally held Evelyn Roosley's wedding. We had her family and her friends and this community of people come together to celebrate her as not just this great founder who we all respected, not just this amazing thinker, but also as an incredible human and a leader. And we brought together what I think of as the Lobby family to celebrate the wedding, her wedding. And I think that I know that I'm an extreme, but that is how I think about business. I think that the business is personal. And this was a wonderful gathering, and it was very validating. But it was the culmination of lots of years of my own personal failing. And I'll back up now to talk about the beginning of the Lobby, because the Lobby, when you don't pay attention and when you don't listen and when you're not intentional, will simply be a replication of all the biases in the room. When I started this conference, the very first conference I had, I brought together a group of friends and said, if we were going to create the 150 best people imaginable to bring to this conference, who would they be? And we brainstormed, we created a list. I think Craig was on that original list, although I've yet to convince him to come out to Hawaii, but we'll get him yet. It was an amazing list of people. And we sent out invites and invited this great group of people. And it was, it was many of the people you think of as thought leaders today. And we built this conference. Well, it turns out that I was not intentional in that first year. And I simply invited a group of people that a bunch of white men thought would be a great group of people. And it turns out, guess what? That was a bunch of white men. And some years later, I had this very, very thoughtful entrepreneur named Sue Kim come to my office to discuss with me diversity. She said that there was insufficient leadership and there was insufficient support for women to build communities to power their careers. And I said to her, I really understand that, and honestly, I think that I was insufficiently focused on this when I started my community. And sitting on my desk at the time was a stack of cards. The first year of the Lobby, there were trading cards. So everybody who attended had what looked like a baseball card. So it was Mitch Zuckley, Oric, David Hornik from August Capital. So I said to her, this is what a lack of intentionality does. And I took this stack of cards and I just started flipping them on the table. Not just man after white man after white man. I went on and on and on. And as I said to Ranga, after about 50 men, I started crying. And it took to get to like 85 people before I got to the first woman in that initial group of people who had attended the conference. And I went through the whole deck, tears streaming. And I said to her, this is what we get when we're not intentional. And I owe you an apology. I owe everybody who didn't get invited an apology. And I've been very focused on making this community a much more diverse and much more equal community since that time. But I'm
But
constantly.
David, I'm going to ask you to stop there for a minute. So after you shared that story with me, I went on to the website of the lobby conference, and the first photo is so compelling because a group of venture capitalists and thought leaders by the beach, relaxing and having a conversation. With the exception of one woman, they're all men. And they're diverse. The men are diverse. I can see Sikh men, I can see a difference in the men, but there's one woman. It's probably Evelyn. So I think what you shared with us is your own awakening, your own reawakening as a thought leader, and the way in which you have provided allyship to women like me, to women now in your network, the women whom you are really helping in advancing leadership and in inclusion, just speaks to your own humility and to your transformative powers, which just by living them, you are a leader. You're shaping a whole new generation of thought leaders. So with that, with what you've said, I want to now turn to Craig Newmark, because you also invoked his name. Craig, you are the legendary founder of Craigslist, and the Craig Newmark Philanthropies addresses several critical issues, but one pillar is the underrepresentation of women in technology. And that is something that you are impassioned about. And at so many occasions, you've told me that that is the way in which you see that we need to remake the world. But I also want to say thank you on behalf of all of us for the enormous generosity that you have shown at so many moments in history. Just last week, you gave $10 million to New York City to address hunger. There is a $6 billion food security gap. So you have acknowledged that your gift is a drop in the ocean, but that is the way we all continue to close this gap. So thank you on behalf of the world, behalf of all of us who care about food security. So Craig, David Hornik spoke about his own reawakening as a white male leader. But there are lots of ways in which women's leadership in the tech industry is constrained. And one of the biggest problems is sexual harassment in the tech industry. And your mission is to not only accelerate women entrepreneurs in the tech industry through funding, but also to develop research to understand the barriers. So a recent report that just came out revealed that in fact 48% of women in tech and 44% of women founders in tech say that they have been harassed. And this is a report that you funded. It's a nonprofit Women Who Tech. So 3 years after the Me Too movement, a movement which toppled prominent players in tech, entertainment, and other industries, what we still see is sexual misconduct and harassment that impede women's advancement in tech and other industries. So I want you to speak about that, because you have also said in the report that the amount of harassment that women in tech and women founders experience is disturbing. We need less alive theater and more people in positions of power to recognize that power, not to abuse power. So I love the fact that you have recognized that certain forms of allyship can be allied theater, that it can do more harm than good. So how can we transition from performative allyship to real allyship, like Mitch and David and Kumar and Matt Nimetz, who I think is the elder ally in this group? Craig?
I like to start with first principles, because I'm not all that smart. And in this case, the first principle is from Sunday school. You want to treat people like you want to be treated. Towards that end, well, while the pandemic is creating such flux in society, while things are sliding around in all directions, this is the right time to help create a new normal where people are just treated fairly. To do that, you have to have some understanding of what the problems are. There's the problem of harassment, which is fairly well known. And even if not, Rangit, you just described the results of that study. There's also too little VC investment going to women-led firms. Now, my focus these days is on information warfare. The bottom line being is that I would like us to have a functioning democracy by the end of January, because that seems like a nice idea to me. So I am supporting greater investment in women's startups via Women Who Tech and the Women's Startup Challenge, but I'm also trying to confront the areas of advancement for everyone and trying to counter harassment directed against everyone online, since that way everyone comes ahead. As it turns out, the efforts I've initiated focus mostly on countering harassment directed against women, particularly women journalists, since journalism is what hopefully helps protect our country against things like foreign interference in our elections. So what I'm doing now is, on the one hand, focusing on the corporate side of things, trying to address the representation of women in movies and in news outlets and so on. For example, I'm involved with the Gina Davis Institute, which has to do with women in media. There's the Press Forward, which is about advancement for women in journalism institutions, newspapers, and more. And other groups of this nature, even including Time's Up. I'm gingerly mentioning that because we just concluded something today, and yet it's not formally announced. But the idea is to create a coalition of groups countering harassment in many forms, with the pointy end of the spear involving the countering of harassment directed against journalists, particularly women journalists. That effort, I've commissioned the International Women's Media Foundation to lead that and to help build tools countering that. A lot of other groups are involved, like Equality Labs, Online SOS, PEN International. Part of this also is to empower the groups fighting information warfare against our opponents. And as it turns out, most of them are led by women who are making tremendous contributions. They're leading by example. These are folks like Renee DiResta at the Stanford Internet Observatory. There's Joan Donovan at Harvard Kennedy. There's a team at the Smithsonian working with Wikipedia and myself to increase the number of bios of notable women in Wikipedia. That's an area which has taken years to address. They also have a harassment problem. And finally, in terms of real stuff going on, the idea is to fund groups like Girls Who Code. This is an investment in the future. The idea is coding is becoming power. I'm also focused, well, when it comes to information warfare, another focus is cybersecurity. So finally, I'm working with another group that's training primarily high school girls in being able to become cyberspace warriors. That is, the Girl Scouts of America, specifically the New York City Council, is putting a lot of emphasis on helping girls who are underserved right now learn enough about cybersecurity to kickstart not only cybersecurity careers, but to actually help the country take the battle to the enemy. So I'm talking a broad spectrum here of fairness in such a manner that it helps defend the country when we really need a lot of help.
Thank you, Craig. These are such inspiring ways in which you're changing and democratizing our country. So I'm now going to ask Vanessa Liu, who heads the early stage venture arm of SAP, and ways in which minority-led businesses can become part of the ecosystem of SAP, to speak about her work funding the ecosystem of minority-led businesses. Now, as you said, Craig, you know, despite the fact that research shows that women-owned businesses produce 10% more than their peer-led businesses, male peer-led businesses, only 2% of the venture capital funding go to women-led businesses. So Vanessa's work and leadership is trying to correct that imbalance. And recently, the Ford Foundation's report on the test of corporate purpose looked very critically at the business roundtable, the influential business roundtable pledges on Black Lives Matter and other purpose-driven business pledges that JP Morgan and other leaders in the industry have made, and found that despite these pledges, that these signatories have done no better than other companies and have failed to distinguish themselves in pursuit of racial and gender equality. But the exception that they made was that SAP is doing the best among all of the signatories at the business roundtable. So Vanessa, I think it's important for us to hear from you, because you're really part of SAP's ecosystem to right the wrongs. Vanessa?
Thank you so much, Rangita. It's great to be here. I actually wasn't aware of that that note. So thank you so much for bringing my attention to that. Well, my background is I was a founder myself, and I had teamed up with a business partner, and we raised a fund for a venture startup studio. He, being a white male, drove most of the fundraising, and we raised our fund in 3 months, like a $22 million fund. And I joined him in the midst of all of that. And I remember looking through his LPs, and I called his attention, and I was like, Andy, do you realize that out of the 57 investors that we have, only 5 are women? And he was just not aware of that at all. And it was just, David, your story was just very much in line with what he experienced too. He just said, I'm just so ashamed of this. We need to do something about this. And so towards the end of the time, after we deployed all of our funds, I just realized that this was really where I wanted to go, because I saw a problem. It was just not being addressed adequately. And I sought out basically ways for making change as much as possible. And then I was luckily recruited by SAP to start our network of accelerators, where at least 40% of the founders that we back, either in our fund or in our no equity accelerators, are run by underrepresented founders. And the way that we describe underrepresented, it's basically those people that have a proportionately lower share in technology versus their share of the general population. So you think about women, of course, you think about people of color, and that's how we define it. And we are the first software, at least enterprise software company, to really have something quite meaningful. So our commitment is that by 2023, we would have worked with over 200 companies that are led by underrepresented founders, either through the fund or our accelerator. And we're already halfway there since we started in early 2019. So we're well on path. And we do this not because it's a charity. We do this because this is good business. We know that it's not a pipeline problem. We know it's more of an access problem. And the PitchBook data that just came out last week just highlights this. If you look at venture capital funding over Q3, it was just as high as it has been. But when it comes to funding women, it's gone down by, I think it was 42% versus Q2. And there are many reasons why that's the result right now, but primarily it's an access issue. So that's what we're trying to address at SAP. We have over 440,000 customers that we work with A lot of them are, of course, like the Fortune 2000 types of companies that we work with. And we say that when we set out to make technology better, you have to ask, who is it being better for? Technology is better for whom and in what way? And we know that the only way of creating and identifying innovations that are meaningful is to make sure that we're very diverse in our perspective. So that's what my teams set out to do. So we have 9 locations globally where we find startups to work with, 2 programs a year in every location. So on an average year, we're working with north of 125 companies, very founder-friendly types of programs, and we're attracting anywhere between seed and Series C companies. And then we have a small fund where we make investments in primarily seed stage companies. And we always have this lens, and this is more about being intentional. So I think, like to David's point, the intentionality is incredibly important. It makes you look in different ways. It makes you strike partnerships in different ways. And you are also going to look for innovations in different ways. And what has been very meaningful is that our customers are responding to it. So I work with customers such as the Home Depot or Walmart or like an H&M. And for them, they say, thank you. You know, we've been looking for innovative solutions and you're bringing to us solutions that we would have not been able to find otherwise based on our networks. So that is what our perspective is. And this is something that we hope that our peer companies are going to do as well. We don't want to be the only company that has this type of commitment. We think it's great that there are so many companies now that are starting to have funds dedicated to this. You take a look at Morgan Stanley and they're having a multicultural innovation lab that's focused on underrepresented founders. Goldman Sachs has launched with GS. And you see that, you know, now SoftBank has an opportunity fund that is now focused on Black and Latinx founders. We think that that's just the start. Corporates really can play a significant part in this because of the influence that they have, the dollars that they control, and also because corporate venture capital is also rising.
So that was such a powerful way of actualizing the fact that diversity is not only the moral thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. And looking at the ways in which that businesses can bring their purpose, their platform, their bully pulpit, and their sense of, you know, global reach to address issues of diversity. So I want to go back in history to the time when Kumar Mahadeva, the legendary founder of Cognizant, the world's leading IT service company, found this giant, right? With an idea that he incubated while he was still at another company. But what is so important about his influence on me and my work is that last year when I met him once again at the Harvard Club in New York, he gave me a very enlightened, he shared with me a very enlightening story. He said to me, Rangita, the JP Morgan model of financing is now outdated. We have to look at financial models like Ant Financial, which are remaking the world. And Ant Financial, as many of you know, is the most valuable fintech in the world. And it is the most valuable unicorn. And it is bringing those previously unbanked to the system. So, Kumar, my question to you is, tell us about that moment when you founded Cognizant in as not a white male, but a man of color. So, you know, we've been talking about all these white men who are founders and venture capitalists. You built one of the world's most successful IT companies as a South Asian American. So I wanted to remind us the ways in which you built that success, but also talk to us a little bit about this kind of transformative thinking that you shared with me, that we need different models of financial inclusion. That the JP Morgan model needs to be now transformed, and we have to look at the ways in which the unbanked can be bankable. Kumar?
Thank you, Rangita. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for putting this together. It's a great forum. So where do I start? I think, in terms of Cognizant, which, by the way, I'm not sure most people are not familiar with it, but it is an IT services company that does work for large corporations. It's traded on NASDAQ. It's got 16 billion of revenue and 40 billion market cap. When I started it, interestingly, I was interested in building a diverse firm from day one. It was somewhat intrinsically diverse because we had operations in India and China and Eastern Europe and other places. So we had a diversity of countries and cultures. The biggest challenge I had was women. And it was particularly in places like India, most companies are biased, I would say. And it is hard for women to advance. And so what I did, and I think it's similar to Craig mentioned this as well, but we set up something called Cognizant Academy, which is sort of a university within our firm, because many women didn't have degrees in science and engineering. So we had to bring women from other disciplines and train them in the software world. So that helped us fill the entry-level pipeline. And the other thing we were very focused on doing is, as people advanced, making sure that women advance. And the way we did that is to make the process objective as possible. So we collected a lot of data on everyone, like customer satisfaction and what their peers thought of them and subordinates and so on and so forth. And we had a central group of people who decided on advancing. So we could keep an eye on women and make sure that they're not being overlooked when objectively their performance has been great. So I'm very happy to say that Cognizant's just been named to the Forbes list of best American employers for diversity. So, something that started 25 years ago as a seed of an idea. Today, Cognizant employs over 100,000 women out of 250,000 employees. So I'm certainly very proud of that. Then coming back to the venture world, let me address the Ant Financial thing that you raised. And I think the comment I made to you was, and this is talking about the poorest of the poor in a sense, and sort of developing countries, how women particularly can benefit because they've certainly been left out. And at the Ant financial model, and Ant, if you read there, is very focused on diversity and social. They also happen to, as Rangita said, be the world's largest financial fintech company, just about to go public. And they started off basically as part of the payments part of Alibaba. Then, they offered a wallet that people kept money in. Then they added a money market fund, which became the largest money market fund in the world. And when they got to lending, they said, hey, the old model of lending, which depends on credit scores and so on, is inherently discriminatory, because especially in developing countries, people don't have credit histories. So they thought of ways of collecting other information in terms of how reliable these people have been and various other factors that they could collect to make that the basis of lending rather than traditional credit scores. And as a result, they've been able to be a lot more diverse in their lending program. So I think, just to wrap it up, technology has a big role to play here, because technology can help companies be more inclusive Now, at the same time, you have to keep in mind that technology can also discriminate. So it's all about the algorithms and what you use to select people or trying to make sure that those algorithms are also fair and that they're used more in companies.
So that was a great reminder and continues to build on the conversations we've been having since yesterday on the biases that can get baked into AI and IoT. We had several leading academics from Berkeley Engineering and the Dean of MIT Engineering speaking yesterday about the ways in which technology, as you said, Kumar, can be a double-edged sword. So that is why we need thinkers such as you help to conceptualize the ways in which diversity continues to bleed into and be baked into AI and other forms of new technologies. So in 2014, Warren Buffett said of Chuck Feeney, "He is my hero and Bill Gates's hero. He should be everybody's hero." So I have, to some extent, brought together a group of heroes. You are heroes who are remaking the world. And there is no greater hero here than Matt Nimetz, who actually worked with Chuck Feeney. He worked with Chuck Feeney, who founded General Atlantic and gave away all his money while living. So the giving pledge that we are all inspired by, that both Bill Gates and Warren Buffett signed on to, was something that was envisioned by Chuck Feeney. Now, Chuck Feeney, if I'm right, didn't sign on to it because he said, "I've already given away more than half my wealth. I've given away everything." So he didn't have to sign on to the pledge. But in so many ways, Matt Nimetz is a hero. You know, and I'd like to, you know, I've had these conversations with him in my class at Penn Law on different facets of his life. He was also the UN Special Rapporteur on the longest lasting naming dispute in the world, the naming of Macedonia. And just last year, he successfully resolved this longest lasting naming dispute. But here he is with us today to speak about his role as the former advisory director at General Atlantic and partner and chairman of General Atlantic. He was also the chair of Paul Weiss. So this, as you know, is just part of his so very impressive history. So Matt, can you speak to us about about Chuck Feeney?
Sure.
And his vision.
Okay, thank you. You said too much about me already. Before I'll talk about Chuck Feeney, I'll tell one quick anecdote from my legal career. And it just shows the point that several people have made here, that we have to listen, but we also have to act. And why don't we do that? Well, because we're set in our ways. So when I started practicing law in the 1960s at a major New York law firm, not Paul Weiss, I joined Paul Weiss later, but this is another great law firm. But the first year I was there as an associate, all the lawyers went out to a country club for an outing. This was a tradition every year to go out for an outing, play tennis, play golf, have some drinks, etc. But the women lawyers, there were 6 women lawyers, we had about 100 lawyers, 6 women lawyers, they were not invited to the outing. They were each given $20 to go have dinner with each other, the 6 of them, in some New York restaurant. And the $20 was a lot of money in those days. And what's interesting, of course, was the discriminatory nature of this, right? If it were done today, of course, it wouldn't be done. But the fact that everyone accepted it, that's the interesting thing, that all of us, including me, the young associate, we thought this was a little strange. Why aren't the women lawyers also coming with the men lawyers to the outing? But it was an accepted thing, and the women went off, and the women accepted it. They took their $20. They went on a nice dinner together. There were so many things in my lifetime that have changed. And at Paul Weiss, we hired 50% women. But you know what? By the 4th or 5th year at the law firm, there was 60-40 and then 70-30 male. What happened to, why did so many women leave? They weren't fired, they were excellent lawyers. We had to develop programs to retain people and to allow the career development. Partly it was family, it's partly people who, in a two professional family, the male he would keep the top job, and the woman would go off to a less demanding job, and this and that. We had to have flex time. We had to have new programs. So there are a lot of things in my lifetime that have been dramatically different. Chuck Feeney emerged out of the post-war period as a terrific businessman, entrepreneurial, international, spent a lot of time in Japan and Asia. And he and his partners had the vision, duty-free shoppers. That is, people are going to travel a lot in the post-war world. A lot of Asians are going to travel, and they're going to spend a lot of time in airports. And what do they have in airports? They have time, and they have traveler's checks we used to have in those days, and money in their bank. And they wander around the airport buying a coffee and buying a newspaper, but there wasn't much to buy in those days, a few souvenirs. And they came up with the duty-free shoppers concept, which they then brought around the world and made a tremendous amount of money. And Chuck, very simple guy, lived, his watch is a $10 watch. He doesn't own a home. He lives in a little apartment. He travels only, and he's still alive, and travels coach. And he said, I don't need a lot of money, and I'm going to give it all away, all of it. And he set up a foundation. And the unique part is he's given away now all his money. Most of it he invested with our firm, General Atlantic, which I was chief operating officer after my legal career. And we made him a lot of more money. So he gave away $8 billion. And he claims he has nothing left. He probably has a little bit left because he's not starving. And he doesn't need the help of the food bank that David is subsidizing. But he lives very, very simple life. But his other concept was not only giving it away, but giving while living. So his foundation is not like the Ford Foundation or the Carnegie Foundation, where you set up a foundation and the principals invested and you give away the income, which is a fine concept. It's a very nice model. But his view was there's so much to do now. I don't want to set up a big organization that is going to last for 100 years. I don't even want to last for 20 years. I wanted to give all my money away while I could watch it being given away. And he did that on a global basis. And many, many people, poor people, benefited by that. We at General Atlantic, which he founded a private equity firm, and we invested a lot of his money. He didn't allocate it to everyone. He gave big chunk to us, and fortunately we were able to make him a lot of money. We follow his pattern in terms of pushing people to be philanthropic. Everyone in the firm, including the young people, are expected to be active in their activities. And we have a matching program, which I set up there. We match 2 for 1. But if you're active in the organization, we match it 3 to 1. So in other words, if you give to the United Way $100, we match $100. But if you're on the board of something or other and you give $1,000, we match it with $3,000. So this is encouraging people to be active, and we do this globally. So we have an office in India. We do charitable work in India, and everyone, the young people, are pushed to find things that are meaningful to them, meaningful to their societies. And Chuck's vision of giving and pushing entrepreneurship, pushing young people to do things that are exciting, and then taking your money and using it creatively is a model for active philanthropy, not just sitting back and writing a few checks, but being actively. Yeah.
So thank you, Matt. And I'm glad that we started with Mitch And we are ending with you because Mitch talked about some of the ways in which his firm is looking at retaining women. And you spoke about how if you don't put in those concrete steps the way he has, whether it is through the diversity lab, whether it is through what he has called the bias interrupters, whether it is on ramping and flex hours, you cannot retain the best talents. And we're not talking about women, we're talking about the best talents. So on that note, I want to now share with you some of the questions that have come in and ask each of you to conceptualize those questions and address them in 2 minutes each. So here are the questions. Mihir, what additional steps can US business leaders take to increase diversity in the workforce? What is the best way to ensure diversity in the workforce, especially in a time of virtual work? And then from one of our Chinese scholars, Jenning Yong, according to a 2020 survey of startup founders, nearly 50% of women founders were told they would raise more money if they were a man. What do you think are some concrete steps that could be taken by investors to address this sex-based harassment? How can you do more to use the business platform to advance equality? So 4 questions that could be summed up and conceptualized. I'm going to start with David. David, you have 2 minutes.
I'd just go back again to intentionality. I think that people are, I'm increasingly of the belief that that there's a lot of performative behavior that doesn't necessarily result in people changing how they act. And we heard earlier about programs that said we're going to require that a certain number of the candidates meet a particular profile. I think that I'm on boards where we have these conversations all the time where someone will say, oh, I think that so-and-so these are great candidates, but this is the best candidate. And the best candidate inevitably is a white man. And you say, well, okay, let's talk about great candidates. Let's talk about qualified candidates. Let's talk about, because bias is leading to leading in really influencing these determinations. So I think intentionality, I think being purposeful, and I think being specific. And allowing for specificity around how you're going to make these considered decisions will help us to avoid some of the natural biases.
So that is very interesting because we are going to have Renee Lessert, who is your partner and the CEO of Bill.com, to speak to us. At an earlier time when he spoke to my class, he said that the intentionality is such that he does not look at blind resumes. He really wants to know who is applying so that he can then choose the best and diverse candidate. So I think this is very interesting because there is right now a national conversation on blind resumes, blind auditions, and the ways in which we can best unpack bias. But being able to be intentional about unpacking biases and being aware of the candidate in front of you, I think is an excellent way of, going about unpacking those implicit biases. Craig, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes. What was this question?
So I wanted to conceptualize the questions, but one of the last questions was how can we use the business platform more powerfully to advance equality? And how can we address some of the biases, some of the ways in which women are discriminated in venture funding?
The hard part is to practice what you preach, to not only talk about addressing the arc of the moral universe, which is how I think about it, and then to do something about it. That's difficult in business sometimes because there's entrenched interests and so on. I tend to focus on it in philanthropy in terms of paving the way in ways that I've already discussed a fair amount. The idea is to practice it, though, and to not stop.
Excellent. Vanessa? Vanessa, can you speak about the venture capital part of the question? How do we address gender bias and gender discrimination in venture capital?
I think there are several ways of tackling the issue. I think first and foremost, you need to have a much more diverse group of people when it comes to those that represent the VC world. And I think we all know that what the statistics are, but just for the folks in the audience, it is very much still a profession that is quite homogeneous, and that needs to change over time. So you need to have GPs that can reflect what what the general population looks like. And it's also incumbent on institutional VCs who already are established with various funds to go out there and to source GPs while they build out new funds who are more diverse. So that's the first part. I think the second part too is there also needs to be an intentionality. I'm stealing David's term, and when it comes to looking at the types of companies you source. I think that when you do look at different types of ideas and innovations, I might be a little bit controversial in saying this, but I think there are not many novel ideas out there. Chances are you're going to find a business that looks very similar, but being founded by somebody else. And I think it's really important to go out there and say, well, who else could be developing this type of business and in what way? And would that give us a different perspective? And really just pound the pavement. It's really easy to lean upon your networks. I'm also a product of that. I happen to have graduated from great schools. In terms of going to Harvard College and Harvard Law School, for instance, it's very easy for me to just fall back on that network and say, well, those are the types of entrepreneurs that I source from, but that is not going to lead to a great result. So you have to really be out there and making sure that you get to know people from different communities. So that is just as important as a GP. And I think to founders out there who are looking for venture funding, I think it's incredibly important to just build those relationships with people who can help you through this process. And I think that's one thing that I've definitely come to see. There are many people who recognize this problem, and obviously everyone here around the table can be your ally, and just being able to not be afraid of asking for help. I think that's also something that I've seen again and again. If you don't have access to those networks, you don't ask for that. I had to model my business partner and thank him for teaching me how to network, even though I spent many years at McKinsey at a consulting firm where I wasn't taught that. And I remember just realizing, so it's not based on merit. You mean I'm not going to be recognized based on my merit? Unfortunately not. A lot of it is just the relationships that you have. So being able to get access to those types of opportunities is just as important.
So relationships, you're going back to relationships, and David has often told me it's not about networking, it's about building relationships. Networking is the kind of very superficial idea, while networking really is about building common cause, and that he funds people and audacious ideas. So David, going back to Vanessa's question, you had told us at an earlier class that when two women who had graduated from Harvard Business School had an idea about fashion, there were men who poo-pooed that idea because it was thought to be frivolous. Can you very quickly speak to that and the dynamic of bias?
Yeah, it was worse than that, right? It was worse than that because these were women who had Harvard Business School degrees, who had been bankers at the most significant banks in the country, had proven themselves to be very, very thoughtful. And yet when we ultimately assessed their business, I was told by an individual in the room that he didn't think that they were particularly analytical. And it was just not true, right? It was just not true, but the combination of their sex and their chosen field were sufficient to give the impression to this individual that they hadn't been rigorous. they'd been their presentation was rigorous. They were women of incredible stature, and yet this was the bias they were facing. And so I just think, as I said, Rangita, I am hopeful that time is helping us heal some of these wounds, but this is very strongly inbred behavior from systems that have promoted that. So it was very disappointing to see, and it was just a very important reminder that this is what we encounter all the time, what women encounter all the time.
Thank you. So Kumar, you also have your own venture capital fund, and you go out of your way to fund some of the most exciting, novel, and cutting-edge ideas, which also happen to be ideas led by diverse groups of entrepreneurs and leaders. So can you speak a little bit about your own vision when you fund the best ideas that come to you?
Yes, and I'm not sure if the previous speaker was referring to Rent a Runway, but I was lucky enough to be an early investor in that.
I was not. We saw that business many times, and we stupidly did not say yes, but we should have.
So you did,
yeah,
you
I
did
think,
fund the Rent the Runway. Yes, of course, David was referring to Rent the Runway. Yes, the two women from Harvard Business School. Yes, Kumar. So you were one of the.
So in my personal investing, frankly, since I'm focused very much on software tech, it's been hard to find, at least for me, the right companies, female founder companies to invest in. The Rent a Runway was one, and there was one other. What I have done is I've invested in some funds which are focused on female founders. There's one called 1843 Capital, another one called Female Founders Fund. And Female Founders Fund in particular has been very, very effective because they have a large network of former founders, female former founders, who help businesses, women entrepreneurs grow their businesses, scale their businesses. And they've delivered actually excellent returns. So, and one of the things that Anu Dougal, who was the founder of that, said to me is, women's businesses actually get lower valuations than men's businesses because of the lack of access. So she says, I can invest in a woman's business for a lower price than I can if the same business was founded by a man. Now, I don't know if that's a fair thing to do, but it does mean you get superior returns. And at the same time, you are, I'm pretty hopeful that these more seed, very early stage funds will build enough women entrepreneurs so that they can start competing in the unicorn world. One of the reasons that women have gotten squeezed out as a percentage of VC is because the large unicorns have raised hundreds of billions of dollars private capital, and almost none of them is led by women. And so we have to create that pipeline, I think, of people that build that sort of business.
So that was very, very insightful and exciting. So Matt, I'm going to ask you to conclude this very, very fascinating conversation with your understanding of how business can be a platform for social and public good.
So I'm also an investor in Female Founders Fund, FFF, and I know Anu Dougal very well, and her father very well, who is an advisor to us in India, and they have good returns. I think two things I'd say. One is in the legal profession, where I also spent many years, one of the reasons we have many, many more women lawyers in the big firms and smaller firms too, is because the law schools are now 50 or 60% women. When I was at Harvard Law School, I think it may have been 10% women, and I was on the Harvard Law Review. We had one woman on the Harvard Law Review, one woman, no minorities, out of 50 people on the Harvard Law Review. So that has changed dramatically. And so when people recruit at Harvard Law School and other law schools, if you have 50% women, you're starting to hire many, many more women. And it works its way into the firms, and now the partnerships are different. If the business schools were 50% women, and business programs were 50% women, and tech programs were 50% women, you have much more. My daughter teaches math in the middle school, and she says girls are better at math than men up to high school. And then in high school, something changes in the social world, and girls stop getting excited about math. When you get to college and graduate school in math, is mostly men. So those things have to change to get the pipeline right. I think after the pandemic, this emphasis on new systems of work, hybrid systems of work, give us a big opportunity. One is there'll be more flexibility. There'll be different systems. We don't know what's going to come. Different places will have different things, different industries, different. However, one thing is clear. Not everyone has to get up and commute into the office or into the factory and then commute back. There'll be much more flexibility. That's good for women. It's also good for geographic spread and therefore reaching people who don't live in the same place. So I think that we should make a big push in the post-pandemic world to accelerate the hiring of minorities and women with new work patterns that make it easier for them to participate. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. So the future of work is female. So said one of our leaders who's going to be speaking with us tomorrow. She is also an entrepreneur and headed a startup, which was then sold to LinkedIn, Microsoft. So Matt, thank you for bringing us to the future and looking at ways in which this conversation can help build back stronger and build back with the idea of equality, both race and gender, as the backbone, as the cornerstone, as what I would say the kind of bedrock of building back stronger. Thank you, all of you. As Greta Thunberg said last year at the World Economic Forum, the world belongs to all of you who are in the process of remaking the world. So this is such an important moment in time to rebuild the world. And we are very thankful that we have leaders like you who are in the process of remaking the world in a more diverse image. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.